皆様お待たせいたしました。それではセッション再開を行いたいと思います。Thank you all for waiting. Let's resume the session. それではテーマ The theme will be Yat Siu Fireside Chat. Speakers will be Animoca Brands Limited co-founder and executive chairman Yat Siu and Kantan Games Inc CEO Serkan Toto. Please come up to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. How's everybody doing? How are you doing, Yat?
I'm great, thank you. It's always a great pleasure to be in Tokyo.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, and this is just like such a gigantic venue, like so many people, right? And you don't even realize it's not a bubble that we're currently in. If you come here, right, you would think that it's just like we're in the middle of a bubble, right? Right now, I mean, judging by the activity and the energy, like at this conference.
There's a lot of energy outside of the halls, as is typically the case, and a lot of, and I think to me, this is true for every Web3 conference around the world, because generally it speaks towards young people, right? And I think there's an excitement around opportunity that most other industries, I don't think, have the same type of vibrancy. So really excited about Web3 in general.
Yeah, so when I came, I got pitched within 20 seconds, so somebody was talking to me, not pitched, but, they were introducing their blockchain game startup to me. So for the maybe very few people in the room that don't know who you are and what Animoca Brands is, can you give us a quick overview?
Sure, Animoca Brands is a company that's headquartered in Hong Kong. Today has about 1,000 employees. We recently posted our financials, so we have about $3 billion in assets. And multi-$100 million sort of bookings revenue base. The business itself obviously started as a gaming company, but today really is heavily focused on Web3 with a mission to basically deliver true digital property rights. Most people might know us as an investor in the space. It is true, we've been a big investor in the sense that we've done over 540 investments in Web3 so far with companies that you might have heard of. Whether it's OpenSea, Magic Eden, obviously we own the Sandbox, Decentraland, Yuga Labs, and so forth. But we're actually also builder operators of our own products and services, like for instance Mochaverse, or basically what we have with Rev Racing, and of course with various other projects that we build in-house as well. So we're mostly an operator, but we have made a big bet on the industry by investing, which we think, we can talk about this later, but we think it's a crucial element of growing in Web3 is to invest in Web3.
Right. And yeah, before we dive a little bit deeper into Animoca Brands, maybe just as a reaction to something that's going on right now, to that Ton situation.
Sure.
And Pavel, can we have your comment on the situation? It's a big topic in blockchain at the moment, right?
Yes, it's a huge topic. So first of all, we are Ton's largest validator. So we have a fairly big stake in this. So, take it as you will from our point of view. But generally speaking, I think the arrest of Pavel Durov has been something that is very concerning in the industry, because I guess that some people have put it, it's a little bit like if you're the inventor of essentially a protocol, then do you put to jail the person who created the protocol, right? Are essentially people who invented the internet or TCP/IP in trouble because of that, right? And there's a big question around sort of what that entails. But to me, that also highlights the importance about decentralization. Because I think the only reason why Pavel is targeted is because there's an assumption that he controls essentially the network. And therefore they think that they can pressure him to basically reveal information about what's going on. If you look at, for instance, the prosecutor paper, it doesn't necessarily say that the target is Pavel, right? It describes the target as unnamed persons. So it looks like they're looking to investigate some cases, and they want information from Telegram. And Pavel famously would refuse to give this type of information to others, and though probably that's why he's held under arrest to try to reveal certain information. That's my guess, but we don't know, of course. But this is where Ton comes in. Ton is a decentralized blockchain. When you think about what you can build on blockchain, and when you can think about sort of the decentralization aspect of it, it also is censorship-free. In other words, you can now have a network that actually you can have true freedom on, much like the internet, right? I mean, obviously, and our view is that the protection of protocols is not the protocol itself, but is the application layer. So just like in the internet today, you don't expect security on TCP/IP level, right? You can't do that. In fact, you need that to be open. But you can have KYC AML on the application. For instance, your banking application, maybe your future gaming application, maybe your web app. These are things that obviously I think you can have KYC AML because you have to operate under certain jurisdictions. But the protocol really should remain free and independent in order to compose on it as freely as possible. You see this with Ethereum. I mean, let's say, this would probably not happen, but let's say if Vitalik was arrested, no impact on the Ethereum network, for instance, right? Who do you arrest on the Bitcoin network? Nobody. You just don't know, right? And that's actually what will happen as Ton expands and grows, and that ecosystem can flourish. It doesn't matter who you go after, the network can still continue to exist. That's actually the power of a decentralized network that's run on blockchain.
Yeah, thank you for the for these statements on Ton and Pavel. And before we get back to Animoca, very quickly about me. So I'm a game industry advisor and consultant for over 15 years now. And for full disclosure, I worked for Yat from May 2019. For I think 4 years or something like that. And now there's something called Animoca Brands Japan, which is an entity by itself. It got also funded by itself, right? I mean, separately funded from Animoca Brands. And can you talk a little bit, because now we're on the topic, about Animoca Brands Japan, why you established the company in the first place, and the current state of affairs. What do you think about the Japanese market in terms of Web3?
Yeah, so first, Animoca Brands Japan is an office that's set up specifically for the Japanese office with separate shareholders. So we obviously are the largest shareholder, but we have with our shareholders MUFG, for instance, Sunnyside, actually investment groups behind Shueisha and Kodansha. So they all became investors in APKK really to develop Web3 in Japan and to bring essentially Japanese products and services to the world through Web3 technology. Why is it interesting? Well, Japan has probably one of the deepest pockets of IP in the world. Right? When you think about games, anime, manga, film, TV production, music, all that type of stuff is actually very rich in Japan. And Japan has always been an exporter, has always been sort of a culture exporter of some sort. I mean, think about all the tourists that are in Tokyo every day, right? That's actually a really big part of the Japanese industry. But you haven't really been able to monetize it and get fair value for it, right? If you think about the kind of content you produce. And Web3, we think, can solve that, which is why NFTs and gaming and so on become really, really interesting. So we set up the office for that purpose, to bring Web3 to Japan. And we have a few high-profile people that are also on the board and chairman and so on that are basically helping push the industry forward here around sort of Web3. And I think, Japan itself, it's a fairly insular market, which is the sort of the pro and con. Right? The benefit is that as a market, you can have it's harder for outside companies to come in. But the problem is, of course, it's also harder for Japanese companies to actually export their services out. And I think Web3 is that opportunity. Finally, I would also say that when you think about Web2 as a global industry, Japan, despite at the time, second or third largest economy in the world, actually doesn't have a strong global footprint in Web2. When you think about AI, when you think about Google or Apple or Facebook, who are really the Japanese technology giants that you recognize today, right? And in the 80s and 90s, you had Sony, for instance, right? And you had other companies that were emerging as some really big, powerful brands from Japan. But during the era of Web2, actually, really companies like Rakuten are very domestic companies, but they really haven't really had a global impact. SoftBank, as an investor, has had an impact, but generally speaking, as an operator, did not really. So I think there is this sense of missed opportunity, and I think Japan wanted to, I think when you think about the Prime Minister's statement as well, pushing Web3 as an industry, there's a desire not to be left behind in this new wave, which is again the reason why we thought it made sense to open a separate office in Japan focusing on the development of the Japanese ecosystem.
Right. I mean, we talked a little bit backstage about Japan being a little bit slower when compared to other geographies like Hong Kong in Asia, for example.
Yes.
So how do you view that? Like, I mean, is there anything that you can do as a company at all, or do you have to say, okay, the regulators are doing what the regulators are going to do, and then
it's not a regulation issue, I think. I think regulation is part of it, but I think Japan actually has been more open to regulation than most places. So when you consider, for instance, Japan is probably one of the only places in the world we actually have a licensed regime for listing tokens. I mean, that's amazing, right? Almost no other place in the world has a regime for that per se. So Japan has been forward. And even when you think about early Bitcoin exchanges like Mt. Gox, yes, there's been trouble, but people have been being paid out their Bitcoin recently and been making money on that. More importantly, though, it shows how advanced actually Japan was at one point, right? I think the challenge you have in Japan is really one of a mixture of Japan's monetary policy, therefore creating a large base of people in Japan who do not understand money. So, Japan's only had to wrestle with inflation this year, right? Actually, so the amount of financial literacy that Japan has is relatively low in comparison to, say, for instance, Southeast Asia. And part of the reason is that the good and the bad is Japan has been incredibly stable, right? Despite everything that's going on in the rest of the world, if you live in Japan, you're fairly stable. The cost of your grocery has been broadly the same. Your relative inflation has effectively been zero, right? You can buy stuff for the same amount of money. So for the last 20, 30 years, you've had a stable environment. But for, why is the reason why Southeast Asia and places like Hong Kong or Taiwan, for instance, are developing so quickly? Because actually these places are fairly unstable. I don't mean economically, but, security-wise as well, right? So Chinese immigrants are amongst, one of the biggest holders of digital assets. Why? Because they're immigrants, right? Because they're looking for security in another way. Then you look at invested assets, right? So the kind of places that advanced faster were the places where they had a need for financial literacy because their financial situation was more unstable. So I think Japan has that struggle. And although you're very strong at culture and entertainment and have a very strong labor, let's call it labor theory and labor value, the capital sense isn't that strong. You have a small number of people who do investing and understand it well, but most people in Japan don't really invest, right? In the same way. And in Web3, finance and utility is deeply connected because it's exposed. So when you think of Web3 games, the successful Web3 games understand the connection between financial system and fun and entertainment in one layer, but those who focus only on the game don't. And so therefore let's call it the Web 2.5 games that don't focus and understand the financial utility of the application tend to do worse than the ones who do understand it, even if they have less users.
Right. Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion is that Japan will get there, but it takes time. Right? But I think that over time, Japan will get there in many ways. And about the Japanese game industry, so again, because I'm a game industry consultant, I like talking about this topic. I mean, Yat knows this, but maybe some of you in the audience doesn't know. It's a gigantic market, right? I mean, it's $13 billion, depends on which data provider you ask, something like that. Mobile is huge. Almost all of the publicly traded mobile and console game makers are active in Web3. I think the only two ones in the video game segment, like Nintendo and Koei Tecmo, are the two that are not active in Web3. Everybody else is, right? Like Sega, Konami,
Sony,
Capcom. Sony is now the big one, and that just entered the crypto space, and they can do so many things, because they have the PlayStation Network with 120 million monthly active users.
Yeah, so I think Sony has a good chance at it because unlike other of those sort of gaming giants, Sony. Actually, most people don't really realize that Sony has a massive financial, basically, service provider within Sony, right? And I think this is the point, which is that because of the connection between them, I think Sony has a really good chance at actually sort of taking, a good bet on that on the new blockchain strategy. But we'll see how it goes. I agree with you; it will come. It's just I think we are at an early adopter stage in the industry. So in some ways, whoever gets there first actually has a massive advantage, right? And I think this is sort of, in some ways I would say you can't take too much time. Otherwise you might be a domestic leader, but this is a chance for Japan to actually build a global leader, right? And I think that's the opportunity. And we believe that, which if you didn't believe that, we wouldn't have an office in Japan and we wouldn't invest here, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, before you, established that Animoca Brands Japan office, I think it's in Omotesando. Is that correct?
In Omotesando.
Yeah. Nice place. And I wanted to ask you, like, when you thought, I mean, what many people don't know is that Animoca Brands was active, or Yat was active in the gaming industry for way, way longer than the blockchain game industry exists, right? So you guys, like you, basically, distributed Japanese RPGs on PC CDs back in the day,
Yes,
right? I mean,
yes.
almost everybody forgot that, right?
In 2001.
Yeah, so it's ridiculous.
Yes, we published. We worked with Falcom. We worked with Koei Tecmo. We worked with like all of the Japanese gaming companies to really sort of export and distribute. And we also brought European titles into Japan. I mean, this was like a long time ago. Taking me way
That's
back.
even crazier.
Yeah, yeah. So back in the PC games, and I remember Japanese customers, you were willing to pay literally 5 times more money than anyone else for PC games, mostly of the strategy type. Many of them were actually European developers at the time, like Europa Universalis,
Right.
The Patrician, and so on. I think there was a big love for these type of strategy, deep thinking type of games here, which I think you still do.
Right. Yeah, and so fireside chats are a little bit, about also the personality of the speaker. Now, I wanted to ask you, like, when did you basically decide to bring because Animoca Brands existed before the entire like Web3 craze came,
Yes.
before the last bubble came, et cetera, and then you basically transformed the company, like radically transformed the company. Was there like one eureka moment where you said, look, we have to go get in this, or did somebody else convince you? Did you have consultants that said, Yat, you're on the wrong path, go here?
No, yeah. So we didn't use any consultants. Frankly, we didn't have any money for consultants. At the
Well,
time.
you hired me later.
Yes, yeah, after. So what happened in 2017, we actually had a studio that we owned in Vancouver called Fuel Powered that actually was involved in building CryptoKitties. And that actually gave us a front row view as to what happened in the crypto industry with NFTs. So we didn't enter the Web3 industry because of Bitcoin. I mean, we saw it, but
Right.
it was very financial in nature. It didn't appeal to us. But what we understood with NFTs when we saw it was a way for someone to actually own an item of the digital culture that they were doing. And this came very much from a personal appeal standpoint. Like I wished that I could own my Ultima Online items, for those of you who might remember, or when I used to play World of Warcraft. These are items that I wished I could have, not because I wanted to sell them, but because I felt that these were status symbols that I could use sometime in the future for some value. And later on that evolved into not just gaming, but into broad digital property rights. But when we saw that moment, it really was only like a couple of weeks where we said that was our eureka moment. But that the eureka moment comes for both, and I think this is true for all companies. I mean, Apple has a similar story in a different way, right? Which is that it is a eureka moment in terms of this is great technology and really interesting and a personal appeal. But also the state of the general gaming industry was really bad. If you're a smaller or mid-sized game developer, which is what we were, it is extremely tough. Because at that point, both Apple and Google and Facebook and Steam basically controlled all of the distribution platforms. And I noticed that we weren't making games that we thought were right for gamers. We were making games that were right for the platform, right? The platform said, add this feature, do this thing, so you can get featured. So we could, we were suddenly making things that weren't fun for the user. We were making things that would help the platform promote essentially their particular agenda. And then, the marketing department wasn't how to reach users. The marketing department was how to please the App Store, right? And so that twist and that shift happened where we realized there's something going wrong in the industry. And that was another segment, right? So it's a combination of that. So for me, for instance, if you're an indie game developer and you're not looking at Web3, I think, you're kind of crazy because that is the emerging space. It's kind of like if you're a game developer in 2009, 2010, and you're not looking at mobile game development. That's equally crazy because that's the next growth paradigm.
Right. Yeah. I mean, many people ask me, like back when that happened, why Animoca Brands basically, took off like a rocket as a company, right? I mean, you basically multiplied your market value of or the value of the company by what, 20x, some crazy number like that.
No, so when in early 2018, we were a public company in Australia, but our market cap was only $20 million, very small. And today our market cap is about somewhere between $5 to $6 billion.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And many people asked me, like, I had like discussions with, because this is part of my work with financial institutions, and many people asked, like, what did Animoca Brands do right where other companies trying to scale like you didn't do it. Right? I mean, you were not the only company looking at the space back then, right? I mean, there were already like
Yes.
a lot of companies. So my answer was it's the management basically that drove that, the quality of the management that basically drove that. What is your answer?
Well, I mean, the quality of the management is the execution side and the vision side. I agree with that. That's a simple way to say it. But I think the real sort of, if I go to the nuts and bolts of it, is when you see a trend that you think is really important and relevant, and that speaks to you, it's understanding it is key. So I think a lot of companies who went into Web3 did not understand the nature of Web3. So for instance, in Japan, you have examples of gaming companies that have tried Web3 games. But why, despite them having incredible gaming talent, have they not succeeded in creating an incredible Web3 game? Because the game is fun and interesting. It's because they didn't understand the nature of blockchain. They didn't understand that to succeed in blockchain, you had to be open and permissionless, right? Whereas when you're building in a Web2 gaming environment, you're trying to build it closed and controlled. In Web3, you share your customers. In fact, the more you share, the more value you receive. But if you build in Web2, actually, you don't want to share your customer at all. I mean, Fortnite has no interest in giving their customers to someone else. But if their assets were NFTs, everyone could basically sort of offer incentives for the customers to say, hey, if you have a Fortnite skin, come play my game. I give you free tokens, or I give you something, or I know who you are. I can identify you, right? It's a totally different framework. And I think we understood the true nature of Web3 faster, or in some cases still better than most of them do today. And our strategy of investing as broadly as we did came from that ethos. If you can't win as a monopoly, which is the Web2 way, then to win open, you have to be broadly distributed. That was our philosophy. And that helped us grow in that space. And I think there's these paradigm shifts when they happen. It's kind of like open source versus closed source. If you were for those of you old enough to remember, in the early days of the internet, everyone was building closed source. Sun Microsystems, Microsoft even, they were all closed source companies.
Right.
And they ultimately lost to the open source companies. Same thing, right? If you understood that open source would be the future because it scales faster, right, then putting your bet on that was going to be better for you broadly in that direction than basically building in a closed source environment. And many of them ultimately moved into open source, but far later. At that point, for instance, how many people really remember IBM, right?
Right.
And Sun Microsystems doesn't even exist, or DEC, for instance, right?
Right.
These are all companies or SGI, these are all companies that are basically gone today, that were the giants of their time, but they all had somewhat of the wrong paradigm. The same thing in Web3, which is, by the way, I think, that gaming companies, if they don't ultimately adopt permissionless networks like in Web3, they will eventually go and become irrelevant as well. Just like basically gaming companies who are only focused on PC games or only focused on console games, they have to, they have to adopt where the technology is going, because that's where the end user is going.
Right. Yeah, and today Animoca Brands is a lot more like a generalist company. It's not only, you're not only focused on games, because I think that games is maybe because of your heritage and like a background of the company, it's a little bit like a focus point, and because of the size of the industry. But you're a lot more generalist. So because for the sake of time, we only have about 7 minutes left. What do you think are the big trends that you see from Animoca Brands' perspective in Web3 at the moment, and that maybe even like 1 or 2 trends that other people don't see as trends, where you say, okay, this is totally overlooked by the broader market?
So first, I would say the broad trend, and the reason why I think Web3 and blockchain will continue to accelerate, because still, remember, Web3 and blockchain is still early in a relative sense, is not Web3 and blockchain itself. That's a technology. The trend is privacy, freedom, decentralization. That's a trend, right? When you take a look at what's happening, and of course, equity. When you think about the problems that we have, most of the world feel suppressed in terms of their freedom to say something. Right? Most people feel it's unfair. Like, he's making so much money, I'm not making much money, or he's getting something that I should be deserving. That's actually the state of politics. That's the state of the world we are in today, right? And so this type of, and censorship. Censorship is a big issue. There's much conversation around, is the media censored? Is social media censored? If you think about the topics, whether it's what's happening in Telegram, or what's happening, for instance, at X when Elon is talking about stuff, or even the politics in the US, the predominant thematic is, do I have the freedom to say what I want? Am I actually truly censorship free? Do I have the rights that I have? And what is the platform that cannot be controlled by a single entity? That's actually blockchain. So that's the underlying trend. And then the underlying trend on equity is, what's the way in which people can actually have more of financial inclusivity which 30 years ago, there was a growing middle class. And now there isn't one because of the fact that, if you look at COVID, over $41 trillion of new value was created. Over 2/3 went to the 1 percentile. The rest of the world got the scraps, right? So the world has become more unfair as a result. And so blockchain is the answer because you can't have, you can't have a billion shareholders in a company, right? Think about all of you here who use Apple products. You're probably not an Apple shareholder. I think Apple has 80,000 shareholders, but it has hundreds of millions of customers. But on blockchain, if you own a token, you are a holder of the asset, of the network asset. And so I think that those are the trends. And the answer is blockchain. In the same way that information freedom and the distribution of things was a trend for the internet. It wasn't TCP/IP, right? That wasn't really the platform, it was the technology that enabled it. And so that to me is why it's inevitable. And everything around that means that, just maybe one example, if you look at DAOs, decentralized autonomous organization, they have about $21 to $22 billion of value, but it's governed by 10 million people. There is no system in the world where end users can decide on any kind of value that's meaningful. So I think DAOs are the future. And again, it's a future because it's better for the people who are participating in it.
Yeah, thank you. Just as a quick side note, about Yat's personality, because again, that's a fireside chat. Sometimes people ask me about you, and what I tell them is, what I learned over time is that the way you talk now and what you talk, how you talk is like as a persona, right? I mean, you're like almost like a politician, like a crypto super evangelist. You get like on stage, like on Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs and all of these conferences around the world today at WebEx, tomorrow somewhere else, and he speaks and he means it. What he says, exactly like that. Like you see me on stage, he's exactly like that internally. And I can open my mouth because I've been working for Yat for a couple of years now, right? So which I personally find interesting. So there's no distinction between him as a speaker and as an evangelist and as a quote unquote politician and a company executive. Just as a side note. But Yat, we only have 3.5 minutes. So can you maybe talk about the future of Animoca brands, right? I mean, because many people look at your company a little bit like the canary in the coal mine, right? Because you have so many investments you mentioned, and Animoca brands is like one of the biggest players in the space. What do you think about the future of your company? Are you going to do you want to scale the company to 2,000 people? Do you want to get to a $10 billion valuation? Or what is the end goal here?
So thanks for the question. So first of all, we don't have a headcount goal, right? That's not what we have. But we do have a mission around delivering true digital property rights. And we have a goal, we want 1 billion people to have digital property. Truly digital property. Right now, there's about 400 million people who own tokens, but they own mostly in exchanges. There's really only tens of million people who actually are in the DeFi space, who actually use the tokens. And what is a token? A token is a network asset. So that's really important to understand that in Web3, we have a new type of asset that is a network asset. It's not like shares. It's not like equity. It's a network itself. So when you buy or own Ethereum, you don't own Ethereum because it gives you yield, because it gives you some kind of ownership per se. It has ownership, but it gives you property of the network effect. And the network effect is the most valuable thing we do today, both socially and what we do online, for instance. But we haven't had a way of owning it until Web3. So to us, this is this undiscovered country almost, these network assets that we couldn't own before. And so we aim, as a part of our investment and growth strategy, to be one of the biggest players in the space. And we believe this space will be multi-trillions of dollars. So if we are a major player in the space, then we think our business, if we succeed, could be worth hundreds of billions of dollars or more eventually in time. But I think the goal isn't the dollar figure. The goal is the impact we aim to have. Because if 1 billion people can have tokens and have ownership in the networks of the future, then 1 billion people will be better off and will be more financially literate. What happens to a world where more people are financially literate, have assets? One of the problems we have in the world is that there's a distinction between labor and capital. Right? Very few people are actually truly capitalists. We live in a capitalist world, but we don't own capital. How many of your friends own shares in something or make an investment? If they don't, they're not actually capitalists, right? They're really in a labor economy. And I think that's the point. So if we succeed, we'll grow that space. And if we succeed, and we believe this will be where it is, then we will naturally be a large player. And to your earlier point, we're driven by the mission of digital property rights. We're not driven by the size of the company in itself. The size will come if we deliver our mission.
Yeah, thank you for that. And maybe as a final question, because we only have 60 seconds left, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but a couple of weeks ago, Animoca made some heads turn in the crypto space because you were talking like relatively casually, a little bit seriously, but relatively casually about a possible IPO for the company. And do you have maybe a scoop for us here at the WebEx? Is there any update on your plans? I think you mentioned second half of next year. I know you didn't say, hey, we're going to do it, but you kind of like.
So first of all, Animoca Brands is obviously intending to go be a public company again that's listed. Whether this is 25, 26, or whatever is not entirely certain, but we're preparing ourselves to go public as a company. And I think part of the conversation that we had in this article was, well, if you have tokens, then why do you have to go public? And to me, they're distinct, right? Meaning that a token is a representation of network effects, which is a value to the asset, but isn't the company itself, whereas the company is the equity. And I think, to me, it's also important to, how do we bring more people into Web3? Well, actually, I think Animoca Brands could be a Web3 index for people who want exposure to the entire space. Like in a much way that Coinbase, even though they're not an investor like us, Coinbase has become a kind of proxy for people who want to be in Web3, who don't want to own Bitcoin, but actually want exposure. So I think Animoca Brands can play that role as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. We reached the end of the session. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And thank you, Yat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, too, for the wonderful session. We would like to take a photo, so if you can stand in front of the stage, thank you. There's the cameraman, yes, right there. After this, we're also going to take a photo of you with a smartphone. Arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you very much for you too. Arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you. 素敵なセッションでしたね。さあ皆さん、次のセッションも間もなく始まりますので、どうぞそちらの席でお待ちになってください。We'll start the next session momentarily, so have a seat and please wait. Thank you very much.